Good morning, and welcome to Community Profile. I'm John R. Kinney. We have a very special guest with us this morning, as we will talk history and culture with the director of the Center for African and African American Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. We will talk to Ms. Sheila S. Walker about the history of Africans in America before Columbus, what Columbus Day 1992 means to African Americans, and what the current emphasis on African culture means to African Americans. Ms. Walker, welcome to Community Profile.
Thank you.
Tell me a little bit about the Center for African and African American Studies.
Okay. I see the center as the locus of the University of Texas's expression of concern about everything that has to do with Africa and the African diaspora in the Americas. It was originally conceived in the early 70s as a response to student insistence as a center that focused especially on the experience of African Americans in Texas and in the United States. My focus, however, is much broader than that, and I was very clear when I came to be interviewed by the administrators that if the focus was to be domestic, that wasn't my bailiwick. I'm interested in the United States, but I'm interested in the way in which African American culture in the United States fits into the larger picture historically and geographically and culturally.
Okay.
So my thrust has been to focus more on global issues and how we fit into the global situation.
Okay. As the director of the center, and you're also a dean, would you tell me a little bit about your...
No, I'm not a dean. I'm a professor of anthropology. I'm pleased to have the Annabelle Irion Warsham Centennial Chair in the Department of Anthropology.
All right. How did you become interested in the culture, the history of peoples?
I think it all started when I was about 3. I'm from New Jersey, and I wasn't impressed by the interestingness of New Jersey. I was fortunate to have an aunt who lived in Chinatown in New York, and we'd go to visit her, and I was fascinated by seeing people who looked different, who had a language that I didn't understand at all, who had this wonderful writing style. I was learning how to write, and I was fascinated that these squiggles that I saw in bright colors, because they were often in neon or gold gilt, were writing. I was fascinated by the clothes, the colors, the dragon parades for Chinese New Year's. I thought that was great. And that's how I learned that there are other people out there in the world and that they're interesting. Also watching television. I was always interested in the others, the people of color on television. The Native Americans, the Mexicans, the Chinese people, the African Americans, to the extent that we got to be on television. And in the cowboy and Indian movies, I was always on the side of the Indians.
Okay.
So I was always interested in somebody else.
Okay. All right. Why is it important for people to have a sense of history?
Well, first of all, if it weren't important, there wouldn't be so much emphasis in all societies on creating a sense of what one's glorious history was like. And there wouldn't be so much money spent in the United States, for example, on places like Colonial Williamsburg, on historical restorations, on museums of European and Euro-American culture. That much money wouldn't be put into the preservation of a worldview were it not important. All people in the world need a sense of who they are, and most people have a sense of who they are. There's been interestingly, a concerted effort to deprive African Americans of knowledge of our history. We were told, for example, that our history began with slavery. We had no history prior to having arrived on the shores of the Americas. Africa was savage, had no history. Egypt was not in Africa. There were no kingdoms in Africa. We weren't taught, but we failed to, we were never taught that Africa is the most diverse continent culturally on the planet. We certainly weren't taught that the origin of human life was in Africa. So for African Americans, there's been such a concerted effort to deny us knowledge of our history that maybe there's something good there that we're supposed to know.
Very good. I think so. You have a couple articles this month appearing in the October issue of Emerge magazine, and are you a regular contributor, or do you write for other publications?
I'm an irregular contributor to popular publications. I, as an anthropologist, have always been interested in sharing my experiences and the knowledge I gain, particularly with members of the African American reading public. And I began writing for Essence. I have a number of articles that have been in Essence since the early 70s. And recently I've had a few articles in Emerge, but my participation is irregular. It depends upon my inspiration and how my inspiration corresponds with the inspiration and interests of the publishers.
Okay. Who do you look to for inspiration? Historical figures or family members?
Well, my major inspirations have been in my family. My father and grandfather were very important figures. They inspired me to think that I could do whatever I wanted to do. They didn't tell me about all kinds of limits that I was supposed to observe. They let me believe that if other people could do it, then I could do it. I might even be able to do it better. I was certainly expected to. And this doesn't deny the fact of the inspiration of my mother and grandmother. My mother was a liberated woman, still is, and gave me the kind of model that I was supposed to begin to live up to before women's lib was discovered.
All right, all right. Well, that's always been a tradition among African-American women. 1992 is the 500th anniversary of Columbus's coming to the land we call America. Much has and will be said about its significance. Movies have been made and books written. One of the articles in this month's Emerge discussed this issue, and we'll talk to Ms. Walker about Columbus and the impact on African Americans right after this. Welcome back. We're talking with Sheila S. Walker, who is the director of the Center for African and African American Studies at the University of Texas. When you say Columbus discovered America, you get a mixed reaction from a lot of people. You get some people who embrace that statement wholeheartedly and some people who adamantly just dispute the claim. One of the Emerge magazine articles, titled An Honest View of the Columbus Legacy, deals with that ambivalence among African Americans. Why is there a mixed feeling among black peoples about Columbus's discovery?
Well, we, like everybody else in the United States, were taught in school that Columbus discovered America. We were not taught that he discovered an inhabited land that had been inhabited by tens of thousands of years, millions of years perhaps, by lots of folks who were decimated as a result of Columbus's alleged discovery of America. So there are two problems with the whole Columbus business. I mean, it's possible to be uncritical. It's difficult to imagine how one can be uncritical by now, but it's difficult to be uncritical. Well, I don't know. One can be uncritical and see Columbus Day as just another celebration. Heroics. It's been pumped up as heroics. This man braved sea monsters and people who thought the world was flat to cross the earth. That's what we were taught. However, I think the value of this Columbus quincentenary business is to provide the opportunity to be critical about it. The terminology has been reformulated. The idea of discovery was a little too flagrantly unpleasant and misrepresentative. And so euphemisms have come up: encounter, meeting. Now, I think the Native American response to the idea of this encounter and meeting is those words disguise the fact that it was a conquest, it was the beginning of genocide, it represented the decimation of a people, the elimination of groups of human beings from the earth. That's not a meeting.
That's what it meant for African American peoples and Native American peoples?
That's what it meant for Native Americans. For African Americans, it meant the beginning of slavery. It meant the invasion of Africa with guns and the kidnapping of people from the west coast, mainly of Africa, and the killing, essentially, of millions of people. Those who were not dead by their arrival in the Americas were enslaved, were forced to work for hundreds of years. That's not a meeting. And as far as Africans and African Americans are concerned, we have not been counted in this meeting of allegedly two worlds, the worlds of Europeans and the worlds of Native Americans. This has been a meeting of three worlds: Europeans, Africans, and Native Americans. And I think it's important to be clear about the nature of the creation of the civilizations of the Americas post-Columbus. They were created on the basis of a few atrocities. I think we need to know that. However, having acknowledged that and having decided that Columbus may not be such a hero after all, I think it's useful for us to then consider what the positive ramifications are of the fact that we're here and it's now. First of all, I think we should consider the fact that the first African presence in the Americas was not a result of the slave trade. There's lots of evidence that there was an African presence in the Americas as a result of, for example, a trip in the 1500s by one of the emperors of the Mali Empire in West Africa. There are traces of that. There are historical records that refer to that. So I think that's, excuse me,
That's very important.
14th century.
Okay.
It's important for us to know that. It's also important for us to dwell on what African Americans have contributed to the cultures of all of the Americas. When I talk of America, I mean from Argentina to Canada.
Okay.
You know, from Tierra del Fuego to Baffinland, because there are people of African origin in almost all of the countries in the Americas. It's hard to imagine. There hasn't been enough research for us to know all that would not be here were there not people of African origin in the Americas. There are words that would be missing from the English language as well as the other European languages spoken in the Americas. There are new languages that never would have been created. There would be no Creole, there would be no Papiamentu, there would be no Saramacca, there would be no Palenquero. We wouldn't be saying, wow. We wouldn't be saying, okay. We wouldn't be toting things.
Some of the simplest things are a direct result.
Nobody'd be playing the banjo.
How are African Americans commemorating this celebration?
Well, I think the most creative thing that many African Americans are doing is taking stock of what these 500 years have meant to us. The Caribbean Cultural Center in New York, for example, organized a couple of conferences, the theme of which was "And Then Columbus," focusing on the other events that had gone on prior to Columbus and those events that were going on when Columbus made his trip to the Americas that are not presented as major elements in history. And so their point was, yeah, Columbus made this journey, right? But there were lots of other people on the planet who were doing lots of other things that didn't lead to extermination, genocide, enslavement, colonization. So we could also focus on those.
All right. You mentioned some of the good things coming from Columbus Day. Again, what can best be said? What can best be said about the voyage?
Well, I think what's the voyage in itself, I think, had the effect of leading to cultural mix, to the creation of a whole new group of people on the planet. African Americans are a new human group. We are a new creation. There wasn't anybody like us prior to Columbus. There are people who came from Europe. They're still the same people. You know, they've been transplanted here, but they're still the same people. The remains of the indigenous people who are here are still essentially the same people. But we're new people. We're genetically new people. We're culturally new people. We were obliged to create a culture in the face of the worst possible situation. People from different African ethnic groups were assembled and brought to a new place that was totally unfamiliar. They didn't speak the same languages. They were prohibited from maintaining their culture intact. So what they had to do was create a new one. And what they did was create a new culture. And this culture not only exists among African Americans in all of the places in which there are people of African origin in the Americas, but it has become a part of the national cultures of the United States, of all of the countries in the Americas. And we think of tango in Argentina. It doesn't occur to us to ask if that's not an African word, a rhythm, a dance style that's of African origin. When we think of Brazil, what do we think of? We think of samba, Central African word, Central African rhythm pattern. There would be no jazz were it not for African Americans.
And that would be the most sad.
Yeah.
That would be most sad.
So there's a lot that wouldn't exist in the Americas were it not for us. There would be no carnival. In all those places where there's carnival. Carnival occurred when the Catholic carnival tradition met the African masking tradition. And what is characteristic of carnival now is the African input. In some places there is still European costuming, but look at Brazil. Look at Brazil's carnival. You may have European costumes, but it stops there.
All right. Well, when we come back, we want to talk about the current interest among black people in America concerning Africa and things that are African right after these messages. Africa is on our minds and in our hearts. According to our guest, Sheila S. Walker from the University of Texas, are Black people really interested in the discovering of Africa and African-American culture, African culture?
I think so, increasingly. Not everybody. I mean, there are many people who have been so impressed by what they were so systematically taught by the educational system and the mass media, by how terrible Africa is, how they used to be savages and now they're having wars. You know, that's a media creation. There is so much that's left out of what we're taught about Africa that we've been inclined not to want to think about it. Carter G. Woodson, an African-American historian, wrote a book in 1933, The Miseducation of the Negro, that said that we were systematically miseducated about Africa and about ourselves in order to keep us from knowing who we are and knowing who we can be and should be. So I think that the current trend among African Americans, particularly young African Americans, to want to know about Africa is absolutely positive. But it's taking place in the absence of access to good information. There's a great deal of identification on the symbolic level. People are wearing kente cloth. I'd like to think that they will go beyond wearing the kente cloth to find out what kente cloth means, to understand that it's royal cloth from Akan kingdoms in what are now Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, the Ivory Coast. I would like to think that we'll get beyond the symbols and that the symbols are just the beginning. I mean, we've been wearing other people's symbols that have nothing to do with us. So we can wear our own symbols and ideally get beyond them. I think it's very important for us to consider Africa as a part of ourselves, because it is. You know, we can't really get away from it. We have tried, but we've been totally unsuccessful. As long as we have mirrors, we have to be reminded of Africa. And I think it's totally positive. I went to Africa for the first time when I was 19. I was a student at a fashionable Eastern women's college in which I was the colored girl in my class. And that wasn't a bad experience. It was culturally expanding. I learned about yet another culture, learned how to sing Greek hymns to the sun. But I also, I think, was seeking a counterbalance. And so I went to Africa for a summer, lived with a family, was welcomed home, met my first king, made friends with my first princess in Fumban in Cameroon, and had a mind-expanding experience. This was before roots. I was not looking for my roots. I hadn't thought about it. These Cameroonians knew about their roots. They knew about my roots. And they were so aware of the Pan-African world. They knew about Pelé, the Afro-Brazilian soccer player. They knew about Sparrow, the Afro-Trinidadian calypso singer. They knew about Althea Gibson, Olympic sports star.
They knew us, but we haven't been aware of them.
Exactly.
And that's, did the identification or the awareness come with the name change to African American from Black?
I think it began, well, first of all, we've always had some sense of Africa. We do have institutions called things like African Methodist Episcopal Church. So Africa was there. In the late 19th century, African Americans found that it was important for our for a situation in the United States to emphasize the fact that we're Americans too. We want the benefit of this country. This was when the American Colonization Society was trying to send us all back to Africa. Now, I think going back to Africa is fine, except having built the country, some of us should have stayed to benefit from what we built. So it's not absolutely new for us to call ourselves African Americans. I think that our interest in, there's always been a trend among African Americans, small groups of African Americans, to be interested in Africa. There have been Back to Africa movements ever since we got here.
Okay. Garvey was not the first.
Oh, heavens, no. Garvey was the latest who made a big impact, but the most important person in 1736 was Paul Cuffey, an African American who was a shipper and who personally financed the return to West Africa of, I believe, 36 people. So Garvey wasn't new. Garvey was in a firmly established tradition. The 60s, however, was the era in which African Americans began to become conscious on a relatively large scale of Africa, and that coincided with the independences of African countries, the arrival in the United States of African diplomats, the arrival of cultural performances like the Ballet Africain from Guinea, Babatunde Olatunji, his Drums of Passion album. Those were kind of the first introductions of Africa to African Americans. And Jesse Jackson's announcement in, I believe it was August of 1988, that we should call ourselves African Americans is part of a trend. It's not absolutely new, but it was a wonderful suggestion, and I think that that was the basis of our current impetus. There are currently going on in the world lots of efforts to make this sense of African Americanness real. I'm involved with the planning of a couple of conferences in Africa on the theme. There are other efforts in the Caribbean around this theme. There are efforts in the United States among African Americans to make sure that we look at the whole picture, that we look at ourselves in all of our history from the beginning of human beings and in our global presence. There are maps now of the African diasporas.
Oh, my.
We think of the African diaspora, we in the United States, with our absolutely narrow perspective, think that that means the transatlantic slave trade to the United States. We ignore the fact that there are communities of African origin, ignore in the sense of not know. We are unaware that there are communities of African origin in India, in Pakistan, in the Middle East.
I'd even heard that there were persons of African origin in the Soviet Union.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Pushkin. Yeah, the poet laureate.
What has drawn our interest to Africa? What has kept us interested in Africa?
You know, I think that in spite of all the efforts from the outside and efforts that we learned to internalize to deny Africa, I think we may have always acknowledged that on some level it was impossible, because Africa is always there every time you look in the mirror. Plus, you're always reminded. I mean, the whole basis of segregation in the United States has been about our African origin. It hasn't been about whatever kind of admixture of anybody else's genetics we carry. In the era of flagrant segregation, nobody asked you if you had had some person of European extraction someplace in your family tree before telling you where your place was in the bus, what institution you could go to school in. The other stuff has never counted for us. In spite of the fact that we learned to want to deny Africa, it's always been there. It's always been a reminder. And a major part of our maintaining an identity as ourselves has, I think, had to do with that kind of nagging sense of Africanness. It's always been there. It's always been there in our food. It's always been there in our religious worship. It's always been there in our music. It's always been there in our language. It's always been there in our body language.
These are the things that are still significant within our culture that we've just maintained.
Yeah, absolutely. And we haven't maintained them culturally. We haven't said, I think that I will eat some okra or some black-eyed peas and put a little pepper in them because those are African foods. Those have just been natural, normal foods for us. I think I'll have some gumbo. We haven't said I'll eat gumbo because gumbo is the U.S. version of kalaloo that's eaten in Benin, and it's eaten in Martinique, and it's eaten in Trinidad, and it's eaten in Haiti, and it's called caruru in Brazil. No, we just thought it was normal. And so we have maintained these Africanisms unconsciously, which is the way culture is maintained. I mean, you don't say, I think I'll, perform an act of culture. We've maintained them. We may not have been totally conscious, but we haven't understood on some level that we have an identity that's ours, that's not anybody else's, and that we may participate in the larger society of the United States. Of course, we live here. But I think that we've been aware on some level that that's not all that we are, that's not all that we have, and that we have a basis of culture, a basis of being that comes from someplace else.
Enlighten our audience about some of the African American organizations that are geared toward greater care and understanding of Africa.
Okay. Well, let's see. Where shall I start?
Trans-Africa.
Okay, Trans-Africa. Trans-Africa is the African American lobby for Africa and the Caribbean. It was the spearhead of the anti-apartheid movement in the United States, of the divestment of investments from South Africa in the United States. It continues to be active with respect to, for example, the Haitian refugee problem. So Trans-Africa is a wonderful organization. There's AfriCare, the major African American development organization, aid organization to Africa it began in the early 70s during the drought, giving aid to the drought-stricken countries of the Sahel in Western Africa. And currently it has projects in, I'm not quite sure how many countries, development projects, working in the areas of agriculture, water resource development, the promotion of the involvement of women in the development process. Women have always been very active in African economies. The Western impact on Africa has tried to relegate women to the kinds of roles to which women who had the privilege of being elite were relegated to in Africa, in Europe. But one of the things that Africa is doing is helping African women get more involved in this process in which they used to be involved prior to colonization.
Okay. If persons want to find out more about Africa, learn some more about Africa, what do you suggest? Where would they get information?
Well, let's see. That's a good question. Lots of information is out there. There's an organization, for example, called the Constituency for Africa that's based at AfriCare in Washington, D.C. They publish a newsletter, for example, and their goal is constituency building for Africa, to build, for example, legislative constituencies that can urge Congress people, those people we vote for as our representatives, to endorse positive policies for Africa and the Caribbean. So one source of information would be the Constituency for Africa at, on, let's say, 440 R Street Northwest in Washington, D.C. They are kind of an umbrella organization for a variety of existing organizations as well as for individuals. Existing organizations like fraternities and sororities, Jack and Jill, the Links, let's see, I can't think of all, churches, the Baptists, the AMEs, are all involved in this Constituency for Africa.
All right. Well, we thank you for being with us this morning on Community Profile and educating us. And we offer you an open invitation to continue to educate us. Come back at any time. We'd just be happy to have you. I thank you for being with us this morning. I'm John R. Kinney.